I'm Professor Adrian Lockewell, and history is full of wars fought over territory, dynasties, and treasure. But some of its most consequential conflicts began as arguments over authority. The Great Schism was one of those moments. A single creed inherited from the old Roman world, yet two very different machines of power learning to speak that creed for very different political purposes. By the 11th century, Christianity was no longer merely a matter of belief. It had become an administrative order, a map of legitimacy, a language of law, and, in the hands of bishops and emperors alike, a tool of statecraft. To control the church was not simply to guide souls. It was to shape obedience, define orthodoxy, and decide who had the right to speak for civilization itself. That is why the rupture remembered as the Great Schism cannot be explained as a single quarrel in the year 1054. The famous confrontation was real, dramatic, and historically important. But it was not the beginning. It was the visible crack in a structure that had already been stressed for centuries. Long before the formal breach, the old Christian Commonwealth had begun to divide along lines of language, political habit, and competing theories of power. The collapse of Roman unity in the West changed everything. When the Western Roman Empire disintegrated, it did not take Christianity down with it. Instead, the faith survived inside the ruins and gradually inherited the ruins' authority. In the West, imperial power receded, cities weakened, and secular institutions thinned. Into that vacuum stepped the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, who increasingly came to see himself not merely as the first bishop among many, but as the universal shepherd of the Christian world. That transformation was not just ambition. It was adaptation. When political order dissolves, institutions that endure often absorb the functions of the state. In the post-Roman West, the papacy became one of the few surviving structures capable of speaking in the old language of unity. It offered continuity when kings were temporary, when borders shifted, and when local rulers rose and fell too quickly to provide civilizational memory. The Pope's power expanded because memory itself had become a kind of political capital. The East followed a different path. Rome never truly disappeared there. It simply moved its gravity eastward into Constantinople, where emperors still presided over a functioning imperial state, a tax system, armies, courts, and a bureaucratic culture capable of thinking in centuries rather than seasons. In that world, the church lived beside the throne rather than above the wreckage of a collapsed state. That difference mattered enormously. In the West, the church often had to fill the state's shoes. In the East, church and state were expected to move in tandem, like two oars driving the same vessel. This was not merely a difference of geography. It was a difference of civilization. The Latin West and the Greek East shared the same faith, but not the same mental furniture. They prayed in different languages, developed different liturgical habits, and absorbed different assumptions about law, hierarchy, and authority. Latin Christianity became increasingly Roman in its instincts, structured, juridical, and eager to define jurisdiction. Greek Christianity remained more closely bound to the Byzantine vision of order, where doctrine, ceremony, and imperial stability were treated as interdependent parts of a sacred whole. One side moved toward centralization under the Bishop of Rome. The other side leaned toward a model of sacred empire in which emperor and church were meant to cooperate in a carefully maintained balance. And here lies one of the central strategic truths of the age. Neither side believed itself to be causing division. Each believed itself to be defending order. In the West, papal consolidation was not a random exercise in vanity. It was a response to fragmentation. As kings rose and fell, as Lombards, Franks, and local rulers carved up the post-Roman landscape, the Roman bishop became the one institution that could claim continuity with the old empire without needing an empire of his own. That is a powerful position. When political systems decay, the institutions that survive often discover that legitimacy is transferable. The papacy could invoke apostolic succession, ancient Roman prestige, and a universal mission that seemed to rise above any particular kingdom. It represented unity precisely because unity had become scarce. In the East, the logic was different and no less coherent. Constantinople did not need the Bishop of Rome to authenticate order, because the imperial center still existed. The Byzantine world treated theological clarity as inseparable from political stability. A disputed doctrine was not just an abstract dispute among scholars. It could become a crack in the imperial wall. In that system, orthodoxy was never merely correct belief. It was civic coherence. If the empire was a sacred body, then doctrinal confusion looked like a kind of internal disease. That is why the dispute over authority became so explosive. Compromise is not only about ideas. It is about what those ideas imply regarding who gets to command. By the time Europe approached the 11th century, several pressures were already grinding against the old Christian unity. The Byzantine Empire remained formidable, but it was vulnerable on multiple fronts. Pressed by rivals in the east and south, strained by military obligations, and forced to defend the integrity of a very large and complicated realm. Western Europe, by contrast, was fragmented into kingdoms, duchies, and princely domains, where reforming bishops and ambitious monarchs often pulled the church into local struggles for influence. New powers were rising, old certainties were weakening, and the papacy, attempting to consolidate reform and authority, was increasingly willing to speak in the language of universal jurisdiction. That word, universal, is where the pressure becomes unmistakable. If Rome claimed to speak for all Christians, what space remained for an Eastern patriarch who saw himself as the guardian of an equally ancient and apostolic tradition? If Constantinople treated imperial order as inseparable from church discipline, what room remained for a pope who regarded Roman primacy as a right inherited from St. Peter and confirmed by the collapse of the Western Empire? The question was never only theological. It was constitutional. Who had the right to define the rules of the shared Christian world? Was the church a single hierarchy with Rome at its apex? Or was it a family of ancient sees operating within a broader imperial and regional balance? Was the creed a fixed inheritance? Or could one branch of Christendom alter it and demand obedience from the rest? Behind every liturgical dispute lurked a more dangerous question. Who could make a change and still call it legitimate? That is why disputes that later generations sometimes treat as technical became so combustible. Language was not a transparent bridge between East and West. It was a filter that shaped meaning and sharpened suspicion. Latin and Greek are different intellectual worlds, not merely different vocabularies. Translation was never perfect. Nuance was lost. A phrase that sounded routine in one tradition could appear presumptuous in another. A local custom that looked venerable in one region could seem like innovation, or even heresy, in another. Once institutions begin to define identity against one another, every habit acquires the weight of principle. So disagreements over bread, fasting, and ceremony carried far more significance than their surface suggested. Whether the Eucharist used leavened or unleavened bread, whether particular fasting disciplines were observed, whether one church possessed the right to alter a creed inherited by all, these were not minor liturgical details to the men fighting over them. They were symbols of whether the Christian world was one body or a contest of sovereign bodies wearing the same robe. And as always in history, the politics of distance made everything worse. The Roman bishop and the Constantinopolitan patriarch did not operate in a shared, intimate political environment. They operated across miles, languages, and assumptions that were growing less and less compatible. A slight in one capital could be read as a doctrinal assault in the other. A defensive assertion could be interpreted as insolence. A compromise offered in one context could look like surrender in another. There was no modern diplomatic machine to absorb offense, clarify intent, and redirect crisis. Pride had time to ferment. Memory had time to harden. At the same time, the geopolitical map around them was shifting quickly. In southern Italy, Normans were advancing with ruthless energy, dislodging older arrangements and forcing Byzantines, papal envoys, and local elites into a tense competition for influence. That frontier mattered more than its map size suggested. It was a proving ground for authority. If Rome could not shape events there, its claim to universal primacy looked weaker. If Byzantium could not protect its interests there, its western reach was visibly shrinking. Religious authority and military rivalry were becoming entangled in the same knot. So the old dream of a single Christian political culture was not shattered by one insult. It was strained by a civilization-wide accumulation of contradictions. The West needed a universal church because political fragmentation made unity precious. The East needed a disciplined church because imperial stability made unity functional. Rome increasingly interpreted primacy as a universal right. Constantinople increasingly interpreted balance as a condition of survival. Each side believed it was preserving order. Each side was, in its own way, correct. And that is what made the eventual break so difficult to reverse. A civilization can survive many disagreements. What it cannot survive so easily is a disagreement over who possesses the authority to settle disagreements. By the 11th century, Christianity was drifting toward exactly that crisis. Not simply a debate over doctrine, but a contest over the machinery that defined doctrine, enforced doctrine, and gave doctrine political force. The tragedy is that both sides believed they were defending the same sacred inheritance. Both claimed continuity. Both saw themselves as guardians against corruption, drift, and error. But when institutions begin to equate their own survival with truth itself, compromise starts to look like betrayal. And once that happens, a shared faith can remain on paper while the politics underneath it silently remakes the world. Now the chessboard is visible. The board has two centers of gravity, two languages of power, and two different theories of what the church is supposed to be. The next step is to meet the men who stood inside that system, and, believing compromise was weakness, brought the fracture into the open. The grand map had been drawn. Now the crisis narrowed to human beings. ambitious, insulted, and convinced that retreat would be remembered as surrender. Institutions do not rupture by themselves. They rupture when leaders decide that honor, precedent, and control are more valuable than flexibility. And in the mid-11th century, the Christian world had produced exactly the kind of leaders who could turn difference into crisis. Pope Leo IX stood at the center of the Roman side of the storm. He was not a ceremonial figure drifting above events. He was a reforming pope, a man determined to clean up discipline, confront corruption, and strengthen the claim that Rome was not only first in honor, but first in authority. That distinction was not a small theological nuance. It was the constitutional spine of Latin Christianity. If Rome could not speak with binding force, then reform would fracture into local customs, regional loyalties, and competing interpretations of what the Church even was. Leo's papacy emerged in a West that was politically fragmented, militarily fragile, and increasingly dependent on the prestige of the Roman See to project unity. In that world, papal primacy was more than spiritual language. It was one of the few instruments left that could still pretend to universal order. On the other side stood Patriarch Michael Cerularius, a figure built for resistance rather than conciliation. He was not a sleepy administrator guarding inherited ritual. He was a forceful defender of Eastern autonomy, a patriarch who understood that theology, ceremony, and political independence were fused together like layers of armor. To him, Latin customs were never just customs. They were signals. They were the visible edge of a larger Roman claim. Every complaint about bread, fasting, or liturgical wording could conceal a deeper effort to place Constantinople under someone else's jurisdiction. Cerularius did not read Roman initiatives as harmless corrections. He read them as precedents. And in imperial politics, a precedent is never harmless for long. Then came Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida, one of the sharpest instruments in Leo's arsenal. Humbert was not a neutral messenger in the modern diplomatic sense. He was a hardline executor of papal policy, a scholar with a blade-like mind, and a man who treated ambiguity as weakness. Alongside the other legates, he represented a dangerous truth about crisis management. The very officials sent to prevent rupture are often chosen precisely because they can project firmness. But firmness is not the same as wisdom. A moderate delegate can be ignored. An uncompromising one becomes a weapon. In moments like this, the messenger is not separate from the message. The messenger is the message. And here lies the core of the entire confrontation. The dispute was never only about theology. It was about who possessed the authority to define theology, who had the right to alter shared language, and who could legislate the rules of Christian order. That is why the controversy became so explosive. What looked like doctrine was really power in liturgical clothing. The most famous example was the Filioque clause. On paper, it was a short phrase in the Creed, an addition concerning whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father alone or from the Father and the Son. But paper is deceptive. In political reality, that phrase carried the weight of a constitutional crisis. The Eastern churches did not see the issue as a mere wording preference. They saw the unilateral insertion of the Filioque into the Creed as a claim that one center could edit the shared confession of all Christendom without consent from the rest. That was not simply a doctrinal disagreement. It was an argument over sovereignty. If Rome could change a universal creed on its own authority, then Rome was acting like the sovereign editor of Christianity itself. And once one institution claims the right to revise the rules without consent, everyone else begins to ask whether the game is still shared at all. That is why theological language became so combustible. The dispute over unleavened bread versus leavened bread in the Eucharist was not really about baking methods. It became a symbol of legitimacy. Fasting practices, clerical habits, and liturgical customs all turned into public markers of identity. Each side could present the other not as a different Christian tradition, but as a corrupted one. That is how institutional rivalry escalates. First difference is tolerated, then criticized, then moralized, and finally treated as proof of illegitimacy. Once that final step is taken, reconciliation becomes politically expensive. The same pattern appeared in the question of jurisdiction. Who had authority over whom? Who could discipline bishops? Who could intervene in another region's affairs? Who could speak as the final arbiter when the church itself was divided? These questions were not academic. They were operational. They determined whether Christianity would function as a coordinated order or as a set of competing power centers wrapped in the same sacred vocabulary. Theological disputes in this period were constitutional arguments disguised as liturgy. The problem was made worse by the structure of communication itself. This was a world of slow letters, fragile intermediaries, and languages that did not automatically carry the same force across cultural boundaries. Latin and Greek did not merely translate words. They translated assumptions. A statement framed as principled firmness in one language could arrive as direct insult in another. A warning could sound like an accusation. A defense could sound like arrogance. Time did not heal these misunderstandings. Time amplified them. By the moment a message traveled across seas and political frontiers, the mood on the ground had often shifted, and what once might have been a manageable disagreement had already hardened into suspicion. Pride made everything worse. There are moments in history when backing down is no longer interpreted as prudence. It is interpreted as capitulation. Once bishops, patriarchs, and popes spoke in the language of certainty, retreat became costly not only personally but institutionally. Their supporters expected firmness. Their rivals watched for weakness. Their critics searched for inconsistency. So even when compromise remained technically possible, it became psychologically difficult and politically dangerous. Reconciliation required a kind of humility that great institutions rarely possess when they feel their legitimacy is on the line. That pressure did not come only from theology. It came from geography and war. Southern Italy was a contested frontier where Normans, Byzantines, and Roman interests were all colliding. The Normans were rising as disruptive newcomers, advancing with the energy of outsiders who recognized opportunity in fragmentation. The Byzantines still wanted to preserve their historic influence in the region. Rome wanted to strengthen its own claims. Every one of those actors understood that territory mattered, but so did the story told about that territory. Control of land was one thing. Control of ecclesiastical legitimacy in that land was another. Church politics never float above geopolitics. They are one of geopolitics' most powerful languages. In southern Italy, this became brutally clear. Latin and Greek Christians did not simply differ in ritual style. They were entangled in a contest over allegiance, sovereignty, and memory. The region functioned like a pressure chamber, forcing every disagreement to take on strategic meaning. If Constantinople lost ground there, it was not merely losing churches. It was losing influence over an entire civilizational corridor. If Rome failed to assert itself, it risked appearing unable to defend its own universal claims. If the Normans gained leverage, they changed the balance for everyone. And so theological debate acquired the temperature of border conflict. This is why the individuals involved mattered so much. Leo IX was not defending abstract orthodoxy in a vacuum. He needed a Roman church that could speak with one voice across a fractured West. Cerularius was not simply resisting a foreign opinion. He needed to defend Eastern autonomy in a world where every external claim could become a lever for domination. Humbert was not just carrying instructions. He was carrying the Roman conviction that forceful clarity could break resistance before it had time to organize. Each man was protecting a different version of order, and each believed the other side's version would, if allowed to stand, unravel the world he served. That is why the approaching crisis in Constantinople was already larger than any one doctrinal issue. It had become a struggle over who had the right to define reality. One side believed unity required centralized authority. The other believed unity could not survive if one center could impose itself on all the others. One side read independence as disobedience. The other read intervention as domination. Both readings contain truth, which is exactly what made the conflict so dangerous. History's most enduring disputes are rarely built on pure fiction. They are built on a clash between partial truths, each weaponized by institutions that are too proud to admit how much they need the other. The Roman position was also shaped by reform. Leo IX and the reform movement around him were trying to strengthen discipline, suppress local abuses, and restore credibility to a church that had spent years trapped in political entanglement. Reform, however, has a paradox. The more urgently it seeks purity, the more aggressively it tends to centralize authority. A church trying to clean itself up often concludes that discipline must flow downward from a recognized center. From Rome's perspective, that made sense. In a divided West, the papacy looked like the only institution capable of unifying doctrine above the level of kings and local powers. But that same logic made the Eastern churches uneasy. If reform was tied to jurisdiction, then reform quickly became a claim to rule. The Eastern perspective had its own logic. Constantinople lived under the model of symphony, the ideal of emperor and church working in proximity rather than separation. Doctrine was not merely a private matter. It was inseparable from imperial stability. The patriarch did not operate in a political vacuum, and the emperor was never far from the church's strategic horizon. In that environment, Roman unilateralism looked not like spiritual leadership but like foreign interference in the constitutional balance of the Christian East. Cerularius did not need to believe Rome was malicious in order to conclude that Rome was dangerous. Sometimes the gravest conflicts emerge not from hatred, but from incompatible assumptions about legitimacy. And once that incompatibility is public, Every small issue becomes a test case. Every argument becomes evidence. Every refusal becomes a signal. In the ancient and medieval world, institutions were often judged less by the content of their claims than by the posture they projected. Humility could preserve space for dialogue. Public certainty could destroy it. Leo IX's papacy needed firmness to look credible. Cerularius needed firmness to look sovereign. Humbert needed firmness to look obedient to Rome. That meant each man had a reason to resist compromise, even when compromise might have saved the larger relationship. The city waiting for them understood this better than most. Constantinople was not simply a religious center. It was a capital where ritual and power had long been intertwined. Ceremony there was never empty. It was a language of hierarchy. A gesture could be interpreted as respect, surrender, or challenge depending on who made it and who received it. That is why the atmosphere around the papal mission was already so charged before any dramatic act occurred. The city did not merely host the argument. It magnified it. In Constantinople, every disagreement was already half a performance. So the stage was set for a collision that neither side fully controlled. The Pope wanted recognition of Roman primacy. The Patriarch wanted no erosion of Eastern independence. The legates wanted compliance without compromise. The Byzantines wanted to avoid the appearance of submission. Southern Italy added pressure from the outside. Slow communication and translation gaps made every message harder. Pride made every retreat riskier. And beneath all of it lay the same hidden question, growing sharper by the day. Who had the final right to speak for Christendom? That question did not belong to theology alone. It belonged to administration, to memory, to diplomacy, to empire. And once theology is fused with statecraft, the fight no longer concerns only what is true. It concerns who gets to define truth, who gets to enforce it, and who must live under it. That is what made this crisis so volatile. The men involved believed they were defending order. In reality, they were tightening the knot that would soon become rupture. By the time the papal legates reached Constantinople, suspicion was no longer an atmosphere. It was a structure. Each side had already invested too much dignity to yield easily. Each side believed the other was testing the limits of authority. And in that condition, even a procedural clash can become historic. Because once institutions begin to treat their own prestige as sacred, disagreement stops being temporary. It starts becoming destiny. By the time the papal envoys crossed into Constantinople, the argument was no longer about a few lines of doctrine. It had become a contest over who possessed the right to define Christian order itself. The legates did not arrive as neutral envoys drifting toward reconciliation. They came carrying the confidence of a Roman Church convinced that reform required force, that clarity required discipline, and that authority, once made visible, could settle what argument alone could not. And there was a grim irony built into the mission from the beginning. The Pope in whose name they acted, Leo IX, had died before the crisis reached its climax. The legates still spoke for him, but that death gave the whole episode the feeling of a message sent from one age into the next, as if the Latin Church were trying to lock down its future before the door swung completely open to instability. In Rome, firmness looked like responsibility. In Constantinople, firmness looked like danger. Each side believed the other had confused compromise with virtue and prudence with surrender. What made the encounter so combustible was that it was never only theological. It was constitutional. Every dispute over bread, fasting, or the wording of the creed sat on top of a deeper question. Who had the standing to alter the common inheritance of Christendom, and who possessed the right to judge the one making the change? That is why the conflict could not remain a polite disagreement among churchmen. It struck at the machinery of legitimacy itself. Michael Cerularius understood that instinctively. He was not dealing with a minor liturgical preference that could be handled by courtesy and patience. He was confronting representatives of a Roman see that increasingly claimed a universal jurisdiction far beyond Italy, beyond precedent, beyond the older balance of the Christian world. In the East, that claim did not sound like shepherding. It sounded like annexation. Constantinople had its own political theology, and it was not built around a single throne dominating every other center. The Eastern Christian world lived inside the logic of proximity. Emperor and church, palace and altar, doctrine and imperial stability. The ideal was not isolation but symphony, a tightly woven order in which faith and governance reinforced one another without one collapsing entirely into the other. In that world, to concede jurisdiction was not merely to admit a technical point. It was to allow a foreign constitutional principle to step inside the gates and begin rewriting the city's hierarchy. For Rome, the logic ran in the opposite direction. Reformers in the Latin West looked across Christendom and saw fragmentation multiplying everywhere. Local customs differed, clerics compromised, rulers interfered, and the unity of the church seemed to weaken every time authority was treated as negotiable. From that perspective, a visible center was not arrogance. It was survival. If Rome could not command respect in Constantinople, then the claim to primacy risked becoming an empty phrase. That is what made the meeting so dangerous. Each side thought it was defending the very structure that kept Christian life from dissolving into disorder. Each side believed the other had already crossed the line from disagreement into insubordination. So the legates arrived with a mandate shaped by confidence, while Cerularius confronted them as if the future of Eastern autonomy depended on refusing even the smallest sign of submission. The famous theological flashpoints only mattered because they carried this constitutional weight. The filioque dispute was not just a matter of wording. It symbolized the right to modify a shared creed without the consent of the whole. Unleavened bread versus leavened bread was not really about bakery traditions. It had become a marker of whether Roman custom could presume to define the norm for everyone else. Fasting practices, clerical habits, and liturgical accusations all gathered significance because they exposed a larger problem. Who gets to set the rules when there is no single emperor strong enough to impose peace? That is why this crisis should never be read as a quarrel over ritual trivia. It was a struggle over jurisdiction disguised as liturgy. It was a clash between two different ideas of order, and once those ideas hardened, every minor practice became proof of a deeper political truth. The diplomatic environment made matters worse. Distance was not an abstract inconvenience in the 11th century. It was a political force. Messages moved slowly. Misunderstandings survived long enough to become doctrine. Pride had time to ferment. Translation gaps sharpened suspicion. A phrase meant as correction could sound like insult, and an act meant as defense could appear as aggression. In such a world, compromise was not only difficult. It was dangerous because compromise had to be explained to one's own supporters, and explanation often sounded like weakness. That pressure mattered especially in southern Italy, where the strategic stakes were already turning the Christian world into a contest of competing powers. Normans were expanding. Byzantine influence in the region was under strain. Roman claims and Eastern claims collided not just in theology, but in the governance of contested territory. The dispute in Constantinople was therefore not isolated. It sat inside a wider struggle over who would shape the Christian frontier. So when the papal legates entered the imperial city, they were walking into a political architecture already loaded with suspicion. They did not arrive to soften the divide. They arrived to assert Roman seriousness. And that seriousness had a cost. The harder Rome pushed, the more Cerularius felt obligated to defend Eastern dignity. The more Cerularius resisted, the more Rome could frame resistance as rebellion. The two institutions were feeding each other's worst instincts. And then came the moment that converted suspicion into legend. Inside Hagia Sophia, the great ceremonial heart of Byzantine Christianity, the legates placed the bull of excommunication on the altar itself. That act has to be understood in its full historical weight. It was not a routine administrative notice. It was theater in sacred space. It was a public performance of power, designed to say that Roman judgment could enter the most symbolic center of the Eastern Church and pronounce sentence there. The altar mattered because the altar was not just furniture. It was the point where theology, ritual, and legitimacy met. To place the bull, there was to dramatize a claim. Rome stood above local resistance, above Cerularius, above the objections of Constantinople, above the arguments that had dragged on for years. The gesture was meant to humiliate, to define, and to force the issue into the open. It was an attempt to turn disagreement into a visual fact. But spectacle is never neutral. It can project strength, yet it can also expose desperation. The same gesture meant to establish control could also hand the opponent the clearest possible symbol of disrespect. Cerularius and the Eastern leadership understood immediately what had happened. They did not receive the act as a small procedural correction. They received it as an assault on their church's standing and on Constantinople's place in the Christian order. Their response was swift and deliberate, a synodal condemnation of the legates and the policies they represented. In other words, if Rome tried to seize the moral high ground through public condemnation, Constantinople would answer by reclaiming judgment for itself. This is where the crisis becomes so revealing about institutions. Neither side was simply defending a doctrine. Each side was defending the right to define reality. Rome wanted to prove that primacy had teeth. Constantinople wanted to prove that autonomy still had a spine. The excommunication and the counter-condemnation were not just theological statements. They were acts of institutional self-preservation. The tragedy is that both sides mistook humiliation for leverage. Each believed that a dramatic gesture would force the other to back down. Each believed the shock would clarify the hierarchy. Instead, it produced the opposite effect. The more public the insult, the less possible the retreat. The more visible the confrontation, the more costly reconciliation became. Once leaders have staged defiance in front of their own constituencies, compromise begins to look like betrayal. That is the real pivot of 1054. Humiliation became memory, and memory became identity. It is important, though, not to flatten the event into a modern myth of instant civilizational divorce. The people living through it did not all wake up and instantly recognize that two permanently separate Christian worlds had just been born. Diplomacy continued in different forms. Contact continued. The rupture was formal, but the deeper separation remained a process, not a single sunrise. The slow divergence had already been underway for generations. What the excommunication did was transform that long drift into a visible wound. And visible wounds have extraordinary historical power. They simplify, they harden. They become easier to remember than the complicated structures that produced them. The bull on the altar and the condemnation that followed gave later generations a scene they could return to whenever they wanted to explain division. What had been a layered conflict over language, authority, ritual, and empire was compressed into a single symbolic tableau. The altar, the decree, the response, the refusal to yield. That matters because human beings do not merely inherit events. They inherit the stories that events make possible. Once 1054 became the remembered emblem of rupture, every later disagreement between East and West could be narrated through that lens. Every fresh suspicion confirmed the old one. Every attempt at reconciliation had to carry the burden of a memory already framed as dishonor. This is how institutions trap themselves, not only by what they do, but by what they come to remember about what was done to them. For Rome, the episode could be read as a defense of order against local resistance. For Constantinople, it could be read as proof that the Latin Church no longer sought partnership but submission. Both interpretations reinforce themselves over time. Once a side begins to narrate the other as arrogant, corrupt, or illegitimate, the possibility of trust narrows dramatically. People may still exchange letters, negotiate borders, or share language of respect, but the inner conviction has changed. The other side is no longer merely mistaken. It is dangerous. That is why the strategic cost of the event was so severe. The legates may have believed they were preserving Roman primacy. Cerularius may have believed he was defending Eastern autonomy. But the aftermath made every future compromise harder. Any bishop, emperor, or pope who later tried to soften the divide had to explain why the insult should be forgiven, why the memory should be set aside, why the institution should risk appearing weak to its own supporters. The event did not simply mark a disagreement. It narrowed the path back. And the broader geopolitical environment made that narrowing even more consequential. The Byzantine world already faced pressure on multiple fronts. The Latin West was growing more self-confident under reforming leadership and newly assertive regional powers. In such an age, symbolic acts were not ornaments added to politics. They were politics. The bull on the altar was a message to allies, enemies, and future generations alike. This is who speaks for us. This is who can still command. This is where sovereignty lives. Yet messages sent in pride often return as chains. What one side intended as proof of authority, the other side received as proof of hostility. The Roman gesture confirmed Eastern suspicions. The Eastern response confirmed Roman frustration. Each capital came away with a cleaner story about the other and a darker one about itself. That is how institutions slide from disagreement into estrangement, by making the worst interpretation of the other side feel like prudence. The result was not an immediate collapse into two fully separate worlds, but a decisive opening in the wall between them. Later centuries would deepen that opening. Later catastrophes, later polemics, later betrayals would make the breach harder to heal. But the symbolic force of 1054 remained because it gave history a dramatic point of entry. It was the moment when a long, strained communion became something that could be pointed to, remembered, and argued over as a rupture. And that is why the story of this event is so much larger than the personalities involved. Cerularius was not simply a proud patriarch. The legates were not merely obstinate diplomats. They were instruments of institutions that had already begun to fear each other's authority. The public clash in Hagia Sophia was the visible surface of a deeper historical pattern. When power becomes inseparable from legitimacy, and legitimacy becomes inseparable from identity, even the smallest concession can feel like civilizational surrender. So the door did not slam shut in a single instant. But in that sacred and political theater, under the weight of men who believed refusal would preserve dignity, the door began to close. And once that happened, the Christian world no longer faced the simple question of whether division existed. It faced the far harder question of how deep the division would become and what kind of world would grow from the wreckage. What began as a dispute over authority did what such disputes so often do in history. It hardened into memory, and memory hardened into identity. The danger was never that one side or the other would forget the argument. The danger was that each side would remember it in a way that made future compromise feel like surrender. That is how institutions fracture. Not always in a single catastrophic instant, often through repetition, interpretation, and the slow conversion of disagreement into inherited destiny. In the years after 1054, the East and the West did not separate like two cleanly cut pieces. The break was slower, more uneven, and far more human than later summaries suggest. Theologies drifted, liturgies diverged, canon law developed in different directions. Language itself widened the gap. Latin in the West, Greek in the East. Political habits changed. Ecclesiastical instincts changed. Even the emotional style of Christianity changed, because institutions do not merely teach doctrines. They train expectations about who has authority, how unity is preserved, and what obedience is supposed to look like. The Latin West moved toward a church increasingly shaped by papal centralization, legal precision, and reform-minded discipline. Rome was not simply asserting vanity. It was building a system in which order could survive fragmentation. As secular power remained divided across kings, dukes, and local rulers, the papacy became the one institution that could present itself as universal, continuous, and able to stand above regional chaos. In that world, the Roman bishops' claim to primacy was not just theological language. It was a theory of governance. The Greek East remained anchored in a different political imagination. Their emperor, patriarch, and imperial order were expected to exist in close and often uneasy proximity. This was not a utopia. It was a strategy of survival. Constantinople understood that doctrine was never merely abstract. Doctrinal stability helped preserve political stability, and political stability protected doctrinal continuity. The East's model of unity depended less on a single visible head than on a disciplined harmony between church and empire. Two traditions, two civilizational instincts, both claiming to protect the same faith. Neither vision was absurd. Both contained internal logic. But once each camp began to describe the other not as a partner with a different structure, but as a threat to the proper order of Christendom, reconciliation became harder than conflict. At that stage, every compromise looked suspicious, every concession looked dangerous, and every refusal could be framed as fidelity. That is the deeper reason the schism endured. It was not simply that Latin and Greek Christians disagreed about formulas. They disagreed about who had the right to define the formulas, who had the right to protect them, and who had the right to amend them when pressure mounted. In other words, this was a constitutional crisis wrapped in theological language. The creed was not just a confession of belief. It was a boundary marker. To alter it unilaterally was to make a claim about sovereignty. And history delivered a brutal accelerant. The Fourth Crusade of AD 1204. This was the moment when mistrust stopped being a suspicion and became a historical proof in the minds of many Eastern Christians. Crusaders who should have been part of a common Christian front turned instead against Constantinople itself. The city was looted. Sacred prestige was shattered. Political confidence was broken. The damage was not only military or economic. It was symbolic in the deepest possible sense, because symbols are what institutions use to persuade themselves that their order is legitimate. Before 1204, the rupture of 1054 could still be treated by some as severe but not necessarily absolute. After 1204, that possibility became far harder to sustain. The sack of Constantinople transformed old suspicion into near irreversibility. It told the Eastern Christian world that Latin power could become predatory power. It told the Western world that crusading enthusiasm could be detached from solidarity and redirected by ambition, debt, and opportunism. The result was not just pain. It was narrative collapse. Once a community concludes that the other side can no longer be trusted in moments of crisis, memory begins to do the work of walls. That is why Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism emerged not merely as separate jurisdictions, but as separate historical selves. Each side developed its own story about fidelity, endurance, betrayal, and legitimacy. Each side preserved the conviction that it had remained closer to the authentic inheritance. Each side also learned to describe the other in terms that made reunion harder. Incomplete, compromised, overreaching, corrupted, or blinded by pride. Civilizational separation rarely happens because people announce that they are done. It happens because they keep retelling the same conflict until the retelling itself becomes identity. The geopolitical consequences were severe. A Christian world that might have coordinated more effectively against external pressure instead spent centuries divided by suspicion, rival claims, and incompatible theories of authority. The East faced enemies on multiple fronts and, over time, found itself increasingly isolated. The West, strengthened by reform movements and papal ambition, developed its own crusading energies and its own conception of universal order. Yet those energies did not restore unity. They deepened divergence. Each side believed it was defending order. Each side was often, in its own mind, defending civilization itself. That is what makes institutional rivalry so dangerous. It rarely feels like rivalry from the inside. It feels like duty. And duty, when fused to wounded pride, becomes one of history's most reliable engines of hardening. Once a body politic begins to narrate the other side as corrupt, illegitimate, or spiritually contaminated, compromise starts to feel like betrayal. Neutrality looks like weakness. Prudence looks like surrender. Even restraint can be interpreted as a sign of hidden decay. The language of disagreement is replaced by the language of moral diagnosis. The dispute is no longer about how to live together. It is about who deserves to remain within the circle of legitimacy at all. That pattern reaches far beyond medieval Christianity. It appears wherever institutions become more attached to the right to define rules than to the shared world those rules were supposed to protect. States do it. Parties do it. Corporations do it. Movements do it. A group begins with a disagreement over procedure, interpretation, or hierarchy, and then slowly converts that disagreement into a story of virtue and corruption. At that point, every compromise feels contaminated because it does not merely alter policy. It seems to alter identity. This is why the Great Schism still matters. Not because it was the first disagreement in human history, and not because it was the last. It matters because it reveals the machinery underneath many later collapses. Institutions do not usually die when they are weakest. More often, they fracture when they are most certain that surrender would dishonor them. The tragedy is not ignorance alone. It is conviction fused to rank, ritual, and inherited grievance. And once those forces lock together, the past becomes a weapon that reaches into the future. The lesson is almost unbearable in its simplicity. Civilizations do not always fall apart because they lack truth. They often fall apart because too many actors believe they alone are entitled to define truth's boundary. That is the hidden battlefield beneath sacred and secular conflicts alike. Not merely who has the truth, but who has the authority to declare the truth binding. The moment that question becomes more important than the common order it is meant to serve, unity begins to evaporate. The verdict, then, is stark. The split between East and West did not merely divide a church. It narrowed the possibilities of a shared Christian civilization. It deepened mistrust. It weakened cooperation. It turned competing claims of authority into enduring identities. What might have remained a painful but negotiable dispute became, over time, a civilizational inheritance carried forward by memory, ritual, and institutional habit. And the cost of that inheritance was paid not just in theology, but in missed alliances, hardened borders, and centuries of suspicion. There is also a harsher conclusion. History rarely rewards the side that can quote the rules most eloquently. It rewards the side that can define them, enforce them, and persuade others that its version of order is not only preferable but rightful. That is why the dispute at the heart of the schism was never merely about a phrase, or a ritual, or a ceremonial slight. It was about sovereignty over meaning itself. Who gets to say what counts as legitimate? Who gets to judge the judges? Who gets to define the center when the center is already under pressure? Those questions did not end in 1054. They remained alive in the centuries that followed, and they still echo wherever institutions are tempted to confuse domination with stability. That is the final warning buried inside the Great Schism. Once a community begins to treat procedural victory as proof of moral superiority, it may win the argument and still lose the future. So the ending is not only about Christianity. It is about human nature. It is about the almost irresistible temptation to choose the dignity of being right over the vulnerability of remaining together. It is about the ease with which differences become hierarchies, and hierarchies become condemnations. It is about the fact that people often do not leave each other because the bond is weak. They leave because pride has made the bond too expensive to preserve. And that is why this history still holds power. It is a record of a world split by more than doctrine. It is a record of what happens when memory becomes identity, identity becomes legitimacy, and legitimacy becomes a weapon. If this kind of historical analysis matters, subscribe for more long-form investigations that connect events to the deeper machinery of power, belief, and human decision. There is another video waiting on the end screen, and continuing the story there will make the larger pattern clearer. Before the next chapter begins, one simple question remains. Was the Great Schism driven more by theology or by pride? Leave the answer in the comments because that distinction is where the whole tragedy begins.